All right, this week we are going to focus on a variety of formulas. In this particular video, we're going to go through the midpoint and distance formulas. So the midpoint is the point that's middle or halfway between two given points. That's why it's called the midpoint, middle of two other points. And it is itself a point. And because it is a point, the midpoint will be in parentheses an x value followed by a y value in parentheses. The distance is when you have those 2 points to find that distance between them. It's easy to count if it's horizontal or vertical, but on a slant, we need to make sure that we are able to find the distance between 2 points. So that is going to be a length, but because we're going to deal with radicals in solving that, we are also going to work on reducing our radicals. So instead of having a decimal approximation for your answer, we're going to keep it as an exact answer. So in math terms, that means that if there's stuck with a square root of something, it stays a square root, and we don't go into our calculators and go do 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 woohoo and come up with an estimation. Okay. Both formulas are pretty easy. It's just plug and chug, but we need to be careful of our signs and make sure that we have the formulas written down correctly. So again, whenever we are learning new formulas, you should always rewrite the formula before you plug the values in for it to help put it to memory. So work on that when you're doing your practice and sheet, and then maybe you won't need to once you get to the homework. So again, the midpoint is a point that's in the middle. And to find that middle point, we're finding the average of your x values and the average of your y values. So a midpoint, capital M, as opposed to the lowercase m, which is our slope, takes your two x values, you add them up, x sub 1 plus x sub 2, and then divide it by 2. Remember, finding averages is adding them up and dividing by how many you got. Well, I have two x values and two y values. And then the y coordinate will be similar, y1 plus y2 all over 2. So when you add the x's and you add your y's, if you end up with an odd number, you're just going to have an improper fraction for that coordinate. Do not convert it to a decimal. Don't go to your calculator. Don't divide it out. Just leave it as that improper or proper fraction. If it's an even number, then you can divide by 2 and come up with a pretty number. Okay? So remember, we're finding the midpoint and the distance between 2 points. So when they call it a point, it's going to be an x1, y1, and an x2, y2. The little sub numbers are just telling you that you have two things that are looking the same, and then to pair them up, the ones pair with the ones and the twos pair with the twos. Because every point has an x and a y, we're not going to call it a different letter. So we put the little sub numbers. But in the midpoint formula, it really doesn't matter because you're just adding them up. So it doesn't matter which order you do anything, because adding 2 plus 3 and 3 plus 2 give you the same thing. So you just add them up and divide by how many you got, which is 2 of them. That's the midpoint. The distance formula is a little bit more scary looking just because it has a square root in it. But it's very easy to calculate once we complete our order of operations. So the distance is equal to the square root of. And here we have to find the distances, the horizontal distance and the vertical distance. And that's done by finding the difference of your x values and the difference of your y values. So we're going to go x2 minus x1 to find the distance between your x values, but then we're going to square it, plus y2 minus y1 squared. Now, a couple things to note about this. This is actually the Pythagorean theorem, which is the other formula, excuse me, the other formula that we will be going through in this week's lesson. I'll probably have a new video just on the Pythagorean theorem. But this is that same form. So we're going to subtract the x values to find that, and then you're squaring it. Now, every time you square that, whether it's a negative that you are squaring when you subtract or a positive, you will get a positive number 100% of the time. So this number after you square it will be positive, and this number after you square it will be positive. So you'll always be adding, after you square, you'll always be adding two numbers underneath there. And then take the square root of that. So again, if you subtract them and you end up with a negative, it's okay to lose that negative, because when you square it, whether it's a -4 squared or a +4 squared, you're going to get 16 either way. So those are your two formulas that we're going to go through in this lesson. Again, make sure that you write them down so every time you use it, so that you get comfortable with it until it's in your memory. So we're just going to go through a bunch of problems here with the directions of finding the midpoint and the distance between each of these. So I will do the midpoint here in green. And again, the hardest part with the midpoint is making sure that we keep x's with x's. So it's your first value and your first value. So it's -4 plus 3 all over 2. And then -6 plus 6 all over, plus a -6. All over 2. Almost lost my negative there. All right, so -4 plus 3 is a -1. So we end up with -1/2. And again, we leave it just like that. -6 plus -6 is -12 all over 2. Now that gets to be simplified. So it's actually more work when you have an even number that you can simplify. Makes sense. Halfway between -6 and -6 would indeed be -6. So again, if I was plotting these 2 points out, halfway in between -4, -6, and 3, -6 is at -1/2, -6. Okay. Now we find our distance. I'll start that right in here. Distance is equal to the square root of. Again, make sure that you are putting in the correct values, x's with x's, y's with y's. And here it's subtracting inside your parentheses. So it's 3 minus the -4. And I'm squaring that. Plus -6 minus a -6 squared. So 3 minus a -4 is going to give us 7 squared, plus -6 minus a -6. Remember, whenever you're doing subtracting negatives, it's always change. So it's -6 plus 6, which is going to give me 0. Oh, well, 0 squared is 0. So you end up with d is equal to the square root of 49. And the square root of 49 is just 7. So the distance between those 2 points is 7 steps. And the midpoint is at -1/2, -6. Now, they usually won't come out to be pretty numbers like that for your distance. And you might go back and say, well, gee, I had the 7 right there. Why can't I just cancel? The square root is above the entire quantity here. The square root is above the entire quantity, which means that there is assumed to be parentheses here. You have to simplify what's inside there first and finally take the square root at the end. So even though we know from past weeks that squares and square roots cancel each other, you cannot square root individual terms. And because there's this plus sign here, you have to, those are the 2 separate terms. I have to simplify that to one value first. Let's do a couple more to see what they're going to possibly look like. So again, I'm going to start off with midpoint. The midpoint is adding up my x values and dividing by 2, adding up my y values and dividing by 2, and then just doing a little simplifying. 8 over 2, Negative 9 plus 5, I'm still in the negative, but not as bad. That's negative 4 over 2. So this one simplifies to a nice pretty point of 4, negative 2. Now let's go through the distance. The distance is equal to the square root of, and it doesn't matter which point you call x1 and x2. If you rather try to keep things positive, you can do it that way. You can look at your numbers and see it doesn't matter, because again, if I go 0 minus 8, I'm going to get a negative 8. If I went 8 minus 0, I'm going to get positive 8. So if I go one direction, I'm going to get one number, and going the other direction with my y1, y2s would just give me the same number but a negative. And when I square it, it's going to be the same number either way. So I started with 8, or 0 minus 8, so I'm going to start with the 5 minus negative 9. Now remember, the formula says that you are subtracting. What am I subtracting? I'm subtracting a negative number, so I'm needing two negatives, which eventually will turn into a positive because of change. Change. So d is equal to the square root of 0 minus 8 is negative 8 squared, plus 5 plus 9 is 14. So I'm going to have to square 14. Now again, notice as I said in the beginning, negative 8 times negative 8 is going to be a positive 64. That number is going to be positive. 14 times 14 is 196. That's positive. You will always have two positive numbers right there that you are adding together. When I add those together, I'm going to get the square root of 260. Okay. And now I have to simplify this radical. Now 260 is not a perfect square, but it is even, so maybe it has a 2 in it. Now 2 is not a perfect square either, so, but because it's even, I look to say, well, maybe there's a 4 in there instead. So I go off on my side, and I'm just going to do a little factor tree. 260 is 2 times 130. Now 130 is also even, so I can break that down to 2, and then it goes in there 65 times. Now 65 ends in a 5, so I know it's divisible by 5. It goes in there 5 and 13. Now both of those are prime numbers, which means they can't be broken down any further. But remember, when I'm in a square root, I'm looking for two of the same number. I have two 2's. Ha, 2, I'm a little ballerina. So that's going to be my perfect square, is that 4. So it's 4 times what's left here, the 5 times 13, which we got from 65. So I use the factor tree to find 2 of something and determine that I can rewrite 260 as 4 times 65. Using our law of radicals, I can write those as two separate radicals. And then I can see that I have a perfect square in the square root of 4. Okay, simplify that to 2, and the square root of 65 stays as it is. This is what we would call an exact answer, which is what I'm going to be asking for. If I wanted a decimal approximation, you wouldn't have had to do that work. Once you got to the square root of 260, you would plug that into your calculator and get a decimal approximation. But I'm requesting exact answers for all of these so that you practice simplifying your radicals a little bit more. Okay. Let's go through another one. You know, whenever I go through these and have extra examples like this, feel free to pause the video at this point and work through the problem, and then come back and watch the rest of it to see if you got the same answer as I did. Midpoint, halfway between. Midpoint, I'm adding them up and dividing by how many I got. Remember the difference. Midpoint, I'll be adding. the x's and the y's together. But in the distance formula, I subtract the x's and the y's, square them, and then add afterwards. So make sure that you know your formulas so you do the correct form. So I add that up. I'm going to get 26 over 2. Negative 8 plus a negative 1 is a negative 9 over 2. And then we simplify. 13, and this just stays negative 9 over 2. That's all you have to do. It's actually easier when you have odd numbers because you don't have to do anything else with it. You'll never be able to reduce that fraction if you have an odd numerator, so there's your answer. Not so bad. Then the distance. And again, with the distance, be careful with the subtraction sign. It's 14 minus 12. Why'd you start with the 14 there? Because I knew 14 minus 12 is a nice pretty number. And I had all those negatives with the other one that I figured maybe one of them I'd make a pretty number. Then it's negative 8 minus a negative 1, because that's what I'm subtracting, is that negative. Simplify inside parentheses first. 14 minus 12 is 2 squared, plus subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding a positive. So it's negative 8 plus 1. I have a hole that's 8 feet deep, and I add 1 foot. It's now a hole that's 7 feet deep. And now I'm squaring that, though. Squaring. Order of operations again. Exponents before addition. So 2 squared is 4. Negative 7 squared is 49. Now I add those together. Square root of 53. And here's the nice thing. 53 is another prime number. So I cannot simplify that any further. That is my distance between those 2 points. So that is your video for distance and midpoint formulas and how to simplify those. I'll have another video to do Pythagorean theorem so that we can focus in on that. Not so bad, huh? Enjoy your last week, a little bit easier than the previous weeks.